Welcome and thank you for joining our annual Business Outlook with a focus on the future of technology and innovation. I'm Dean Lil Mills, and I would first like to introduce our panelists. You can see their full biographies on the event website. We have Pia Arrhenius, who is Vice President and Senior Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Pia is a labor economist working on regional economic growth and demographic change. She manages the regional and microeconomics group in the Dallas Fed Research Department and is executive editor of the quarterly publication Southwest Economy. Matt Chasen is a serial entrepreneur, investor, and adventure sports enthusiast. He is the founder and CEO of Lyft Aircraft. And while working on his MBA at the University of Texas in 2003, he founded UShip and served as their CEO until 2016. Professor Melly Price is an 8-time entrepreneur, well known as a co-founder of the Capital Factory and the corporate innovation consulting firm SoftMatch. She is executive director for our John Brumley Texas Venture Labs, a McCombs program that connects our graduate student entrepreneurs with Texas-based startups. She's also a partner at the Notley Ventures, a philanthropic organization that brings entrepreneurial thinking to nonprofits. And she has a Master in Science in Technology Commercialization from McCombs and directs that program. So now let's turn to our discussion. It's so good to learn from these three colleagues. And we're going to start with the economic impact of technology and innovation, and then move more specifically to impact of that innovation on society. So Pia, I'd like to start the economic impact with you and to talk about the initial impact of COVID on US and Texas economies, where they resulted initially in high unemployment rates, lingering supply chain issues, and now we have inflation on the rise. Pia, what's your perspective on these economic trends, and specifically, how will it affect businesses focused on technology and innovation?
Sure, thank you, Dean Mills. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. So let me talk a little bit about the recession. I mean, the pandemic recession really was a very unique experience. I mean, there were massive job losses nationally and in Texas. In Texas, we lost 1.4 million jobs in 2 months, which is, unspeakable, never happened before. And unemployment spiked, to close to 15% in a very short period of time. But interestingly, there was also a very massive and unprecedented really fiscal and monetary policy response. So think of the federal government. I mean, they unleashed almost $6 trillion over 2 years to fight the recession and the downturn, and the pandemic itself. The Fed then, in terms of monetary policy, lowered their rates, the federal funds rate to 0 and began quantitative easing and provided a number of backstops to credit markets, helping everything from, entities from municipalities to private corporations. So what happened with all this stimulus in the system, whether it was stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, or the fact that you didn't even have to make your student loan payments anymore. So it was weird because in a downturn, usually incomes fall and spending falls, but in the pandemic downturn, incomes rose and spending rose. And then it was also very unusual because people were, households were on average flush with cash, but couldn't spend it on services. So had to spend it on goods and, and save it. So quite a bit of the stimulus money was saved, but also spent on goods because, again, they couldn't spend it on things like vacations to Europe. And so people, bought houses, cars, furniture, computers, computer monitors, video games, and really this distorted spending pattern where everybody's out buying goods very quickly resulted in disruptions to the supply chains. So, producers, a lot of times factories, whether here or abroad, they couldn't keep up because they themselves were dealing with labor supply disruptions due to COVID, and then extraordinary demand on the consumer side. And so, yeah, the supply chains got choked up, and costs began to rise, and a number of delays, and then significantly higher prices. So I think, it's been a very unusual set of circumstances that have led to the high inflation. We saw, the number released yesterday for consumer price inflation over 7%. It's the highest it's been in 40 years. Right. So that is, that's huge. Now how are technology firms? Well, technology firms, how have they been affected by the pandemic? In general, technology firms have done very well. Right. And technology-related, computer-related occupations have done very well. In fact, they boomed through the pandemic, for the most part, whether it's been, the transition to work from home and the increase in the demand for technology as we meet virtually and do so many more things via the internet and via thanks to technology. It's been really a big boost for the technology related industry, whether it's manufacturing or services. And so I think that's definitely a sector that's benefited from the pandemic.
So Matt, I'm going to turn to you for pivot from this. And there's been a lot of innovation and research focused on creating alternative to gas-powered vehicles. What trends are emerging that you see in the transportation industry? And then Melly, I'll pop back over to you about venture capital in Austin.
Yeah, thanks, Dean Mills, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. With my background in transportation logistics, I see kind of three big kind of mega trends that are happening. I don't think they're going to be a surprise to anyone, but the first and biggest, I think, is electrification. Second is autonomy. And the third maybe is a little less kind of recognized, but is kind of sharing economy for assets and vehicles. And just to go into a little detail on each, a lot of people think that the electrification trend is kind of just about CO2 reduction. I think it's super important, of course. But what I think people don't realize as much is that electric motors and electric vehicles are better in almost every way compared to internal combustion. If you think about an internal combustion engine, there's hundreds of explosions happening, moving heavy metal, moving parts, highly unreliable. You've got to lubricate them with oil. They vibrate. They're loud. They only generate useful torque in a very narrow range. So they're really quite primitive. And sort of by contrast, electric motors, which have been around a long time, but now batteries to power them for useful purposes are available. And electric motors, run with this magic of electromagnetism, right, which silently produces really efficient linear torque with hardly any moving parts, requires almost no maintenance, has no transmission, right, doesn't require oil changes, et cetera. So this is actually enabling kind of a Cambrian explosion in new types of vehicles that are driven by electric motors, many of which you probably see parked all around sidewalks in downtown Austin, everything from little scooters to electric bikes to, of course, electric vehicles and even electric aircraft, which I'm directly involved with now. And by the way, all of this is sort of a result of the lithium-ion battery invention, which of course our professor Goodenough won the Nobel Prize for recently. So it's amazing to see that kind of research lead to something that is so world-changing, not just powering all our mobile devices, but also all these wonderful new vehicles. Really quick, the last two, autonomy, can dramatically improve the utility of vehicles. And then some of these new autonomous electric vehicles, they can tend to be expensive. So there's a trend towards sharing fleets of vehicles instead of kind of the private ownership. That's important.
Well, Melly, I'm going to keep the subject in the Austin area for a little bit here. We've seen new venture capital flooding in and business headquarters moving to Austin. What are you anticipating moving forward?
Well, Lil, it's interesting to hear Pia's perspective and Matt's. Despite the great resignation and a little bit of economic woe, the venture industry could not be stronger. The Austin Business Journal does the self-reported study here in Texas. And in 2017, there were 27 firms that raised $31 billion in capital. 5 years later, we have 31 firms raising 3 times that much capital, $87 billion in that short cycle. And then if you compare that to the National Venture Capital Association, in Q4 2021, they reported that our region had 1.7 billion raised in the course of the year. And so we're on fire from an investment perspective. Companies like Matt's, the entrepreneurial ecosystem is stronger than it's ever been. I was actually talking with my one of my Capital Factory colleagues, Josh Baer, about, the 10 years ago, we didn't think it could grow anymore, right? We didn't think it could grow any faster, and it's just kept up at such a phenomenal rate. So these innovations and the relationship of that to some of the deeper technology that Matt referenced is, to me, a super exciting time. I'm really excited about what I think the outlook is for technology and innovation in not just Austin, but Texas writ large.
Thanks, Melly. I appreciate it. I want to throw a different question to you about innovation impact, and a lot of technology originates with universities. Matt already referred to the lithium battery technology that came out of UT Austin, but it is often brought to market by private sector companies. For people who aren't familiar with a term of commercialization, talk about what that means and what UT hopes to do, needs to do, and why it's important to our academic institution.
Sure. We're hearing more about the word commercialization in the last few years. And, in the academic context, it's really the great research minds that we have at our Tier 1 research university that are doing the work, usually through grants and federally funded research initiatives, and they make these discoveries, right? And the point of discovery where they think, this might have impact, they disclose it to our technology transfer office, as is their obligation as researchers for intellectual property creation. And then the opportunity for entrepreneurs like myself and Matt is to collaborate with our tech transfer office on taking those products to market. That's actually what our MSTC program does. But I really foresee, in terms of innovation impact and looking forward, I feel like the last 20 years, the commercialization of the internet was really focused on, software as a service and some real low-hanging fruit, if you will, in the creation of new companies. And moving forward, I think we're seeing deeper technology requirements. We're seeing artificial intelligence and machine learning and electrification of everything. And that the genesis of those companies will come from research that's within universities. So I believe moving forward, we're going to see more collaborations between the public and private sector and more investment from the private sector in the work that we're doing at universities. So I'm super excited about that.
Thanks, Melly. And Pia, let's talk about work from home and the labor market. We've got a lot of new work arrangements, both on campus and out in industry and government. How are small firms in the tech sector and elsewhere competing for labor when big firms can hire anyone, anywhere, and pay high salaries? And why is the pandemic recovery being characterized by these severe labor shortages?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the biggest changes really to the labor market in the wake of the pandemic has been the working from home. So it's really revolutionized the labor market because it's splitting, you can physically be somewhere and and actually work somewhere else. And so you're not physically tied to your location, which is so interesting. I mean, this is part of the reason we see when we look at, for example, migration to Texas, before the pandemic and during the pandemic. I mean, you would think that people would hunker down and not move during a pandemic, but we saw the opposite happen. We actually saw like a 70% increase in migration to Texas in the pandemic, which, we were not expecting. A lot of this went to Austin, and also to North Texas, so Dallas, Fort Worth. So that was totally unexpected. And what it means is that when people can work from home, and especially, then they're footloose, really. And so that increased migration to Texas. The other interesting thing that happened was it increased migration to even small metros, not just the big cities, but if you look at smaller metropolitan areas, whether it's Wichita Falls or Corpus Christi, you see that, or some of the border cities, you see that there's either an increase in migration in the pandemic or actually a decrease in the net outflow, because some of these areas have been shrinking. So I think that's nice that people can really live in a place different from where they work, but that also means that you can be hired away. So before, whether you had a local labor market, the employers there kind of had a they were able to hire you. You sort of you didn't want to move perhaps away from there. And so you stayed in a job that maybe didn't pay as much as other jobs would pay in bigger cities and so forth. But now what we're seeing, and more of our contacts in the technology industry in particular, but also other industries, are complaining that in places like El Paso, for example, that they're losing employers to large employers that are hiring them, and these people are working remotely for large out-of-state or out-of-town employers. And so it's making, so it's kind of a two-sided thing. These smaller metros can gain population, but at the same time, they may not necessarily employ those people in that location. And it's also put stress on small firms because, especially now with labor shortages, wages are going up very quickly, and small firms can't match the salaries that large firms pay, and they certainly can't match the benefits. And that's particularly true in technology. Another issue that came up in the pandemic with technology firms, though, was that it became very hard to bring in overseas workers. So we know that the technology industry relies a lot on H-1B workers, which the majority of them are in computer-related occupations. And, with the consulates closings and all the public health provisions, visa delays and visa processing, technology companies could not access these workers. So that's been another problem vis-a-vis the labor shortages that we're seeing, that's particularly hurting the technology sector.
Thanks, Pia. You talked about people moving, and so I'm going to pivot back to Matt, whose company Lyft Aircraft is driving advances in technology around moving, innovations in moving. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions and give you time to talk, Matt, about how far away are flying cars from being a reality, and more broadly, what do you think is the continued influence of autonomous vehicles, both on society and how we do business?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really fascinating topic. I spend a lot of time thinking about it. I must have a boring life. I think about like logistics and stuff all the time. But if you think about what's happening in our largest metro areas in the US and around the world, there is a trend toward urbanization that's been going on a long time. And traffic congestion, particularly in and around the sort of central metro cores, it's reached actually epic proportions. Even pre-pandemic, it was bad. And of course, during the lockdowns, there was no one on the roads. But again, contrary to what a lot of people think, that maybe traffic hasn't been as bad as we've opened back up. In many of the most congested urban areas, it's gotten much, much worse. And typical, it's not as centered around just fixed, rush hour traffic times, because, again, more people are working from home, but they have more time to be out driving and taking calls from the road, et cetera. So what we've seen actually is in the top most congested cities, the average commute times and road trip times have gone up. I think there's 4 or 5 cities where their average commuters spend over 100 hours per year sitting in traffic. And this is Boston, this is LA, which is absolutely insane. So this is only getting worse. The average trip distances people are taking is really still pretty small. It's like 7 or 8 miles. But in this traffic, it can take, up to an hour. So what I'm really excited about with the business I founded 4 years ago, Lyft Aircraft, is we and others are using, new electrification technologies, particularly something called distributed electric propulsion, which is just a fancy term for kind of how drones fly. If you have multiple electric motors, you can basically control flight just by varying the RPM of those motors, right? Which controlled by a computer and with modern batteries means that just about anyone can now pilot an aircraft. You don't really need to know how to fly anymore. So we've developed this single seat personal aerial vehicle. We've got hundreds and hundreds of test flights. We're under contract with the United States Air Force. They're interested in military and defense utility for these new aircraft. And we're very close actually to coming to market. Initially, it'll be kind of a recreational service, and I think then we'll see these vehicles used more for first response and public agency use. And then eventually there are some certifications required that will take a while before you see skies over urban areas filled with these new vehicles. But we're really focused, long term in helping to solve this kind of crisis of congestion. It's one of the most important factors, in people's quality of life. Everyone, hates just sitting in traffic. And when you can replace a 60-minute, drive to frustratingly go only 7 or 8 miles with a 5 to 10 minute flight, it's game changing. It's really this is gonna change our lives for the better in pretty meaningful ways.
Gosh, Matt, I'm too curious not to ask. Drones can fly fairly low. Commercial aircraft have to be tens of thousands of feet above. Personal aircraft, where's the regulation on the how close to the ground? And I'll get us back on topic. But
that's a great question. So we designed this single seat personal aircraft to fall into what's called the ultralight class.
Okay.
There's actually no FAA certification required for the aircraft, and there's no pilot's license required to fly it. Provided that you don't fly over congested areas and you stay in what's called uncontrolled airspace. So that's Class G, which is generally below 1,200 feet. So anywhere outside of kind of the surface area near major airports, like, Bergstrom has a 4 or 5 mile radius, and you're not going to get too close. But everywhere else is Class G airspace, and you can fly these aircraft, under, the regulations that exist today.
Well, as an aside, Diane Kenyon in the Q&A said something that I've been thinking all for the last 2 years. I wish we had built more roads while the traffic was non-existent during COVID, but it's a little bit late for that. There was another question in the Q&A that Melly and/or Pia might want to grab about innovative businesses and startups thrive on cheap credit. So with inflation pressures, you worry about that. I did see this morning in a private equity conference that there's 2.3 trillion of uninvested private equity funds right now, dry powder. So it looks like there is pent-up supply of capital. But Melly, do you want to talk about, gosh, are there funding challenges on the horizon for entrepreneurs? And then Pia, if you want to jump in, you may. But I know at the Fed, you know, some forecasting is not something you're in a position to do. So Melly, over to you.
You know, it's a really interesting question. I won't pretend to have a crystal ball, but absolutely there is pent up capital looking for investment. Obviously, returns on traditional investments are quite low. So I definitely think it's reasonable to expect that as inflation increases, perhaps the willingness to part with hard-earned cash for risky investments like startups would be challenging. That being said, if the startups continue to perform, right, and all indicators right now are suggesting that they will perform, the return still greatly exceeds this consequence. And so when you're looking at, you know, 20 to 40% IRR on invested capital, and 2 to 4% multiple on invested capital, it's still a risk worth taking. So I don't see it drying up. I do see it changing face. Yeah, I'd love to hear Pia's perspective on the inflationary consequences of investment.
And I'll let her fold that into the question that I had planned to ask her, which is what's happening in the future of labor markets and economic growth. So to the extent you want to address this, you can wrap it into that question.
Oh, I agree with Melly. I mean, that was an excellent answer. I don't think I could really add to it in terms of the, whether there's capital out there ready to deploy into investments in innovation, in technology, and other fields. I think there is. There's a lot of liquidity out there. There's a lot of savings. The household balance sheet is in good shape still. And certainly with all this inflation, the one thing you don't want to do is hold a bunch of cash. So investment, seems like a reasonable option for your savings. Dean Mills, to your question about the future of labor markets and economic growth, so that's pretty broad. If we think more about labor markets, I mean, the future of labor markets, certainly, we talked earlier about work from home, the hybrid work arrangements. I mean, I think it's going to be different in the future. We're going to work increasingly from home. And I think projections show that a majority of workers will either be hybrid or fully remote. But I think the largest chunk will be hybrid among, the occupations where that's, a possibility. They'll come together to meet, which is interesting. Office space is going to be transformed. Certainly, there'll be less of it. It'll be more shared space. And more meeting space. And then, of course, so quite different from sort of your traditional office space. And I think that's already happening, and that's going to continue to happen. And of course, I guess, and you guys know, you're technology experts, I hear in the future, we'll have these virtual meetings where we're not meeting via Zoom, but we'll be in those rooms with virtual reality technology. So
the metaverse is upon us.
I'm sorry?
The metaverse is upon us.
Yes, exactly. So looking forward to that. So, and then, there's a lot of other trends globally that are going to affect us in so many ways. I mean, I think really the pandemic has sped up, a lot of changes that were on their way, whether it was technological innovation or deployment of technology in the workspace. But there's so many other trends that also were sped up. For example, the retirement of the baby boomers, with all these early retirements or sped up retirements, we've seen the impact of aging is upon us. I mean, we have all these labor shortages, and there's a number of reasons for those, but certainly aging and the speeding up of the retirements, that's an issue. Now, do I think, the counter trend to that is going to be, I think, as things calm down after the pandemic and we settled into sort of a new steady state, as economists like to say. I think aging will mean that people will actually work longer. And I think that technology is going to make that easier. And so that's, that's something good, something on the positive, to come out of sort of everything that's going on. I think in education, what are the implications, sort of the future trends for education? I mean, the proliferation of technology that we're seeing now in the workspace and elsewhere just means that, educational institutions have to transition to lifelong learning. Workers have to transition to lifelong learning. That's so important. And for everybody. I mean, even blue collar occupations, similarly, technology is being increasingly integrated into those as well. Then the other interesting thing is the supply chain, and this is more of a near-term thing, and I don't know if it's going to last, but supply chain disruptions and all this geopolitical tension, frankly, started before the pandemic, with like the trade, trade war or whatever they call it with China and all the tariffs that were imposed on our trading partners and so forth. So there's this idea out there, and now the supply chain disruptions, the fact that we can't get semiconductors, and sort of half of all semiconductors are made in Asia. I mean, so nearshoring and reshoring, is that going to be something in the medium term that we're going to see more of? Less free trade, less, multilateral trade agreements, and more nearshoring and reshoring. That's another interesting, possible future scenario, and that certainly cuts both ways in terms of the economics. It's not necessarily good for growth in the long term, but you can see, if supply chains are not reliable and they're not safe, and you can't rely on your trading partners, then that may come to pass.
P, I appreciate your talking a little bit about students and the future of work. And Melly, you direct our Master of Science in Technology Commercialization. And, one of our sister sleeves in that ecosystem has 900 undergraduates getting a minor in entrepreneurship. Yeah. What opportunities are you giving, should we be giving students at UT Austin and elsewhere to position them to be the next generation of leaders in a technology-driven economy?
I ponder that question often as an educator, Lil, and I'm just so grateful to hear Pia's perspective on sort of the longer term. The threads I keep pulling out of the things I read and the conversations I have like this are that things continue to play out on a global scale, right? And the fundamentals of an undergraduate education, I focus mostly in the early stage, which happens to be a high growth, hyper growth sector. And the skills related to that haven't changed. And they haven't changed whether you want to be a founder of a startup or whether you want to be an innovator within a large company, right? Those fundamental skills remain the same. Time management, project management, communication skills, basic financial literacy, the ability to take a concept and present it in a cohesive format and do the work to help your audience understand why they should invest in that, whether that's a venture capital making the investment or an internal budget allocation at a larger company. So at an undergraduate level, I think absolutely the fundamentals are still there. At a graduate level, as we see, I alluded to the more technologically complex next generation of entrepreneurship. I think it's opportunities for those graduate students who might not pursue a tenure track role, right? Just a practical application of a subject matter expert PhD in computer science, right? It's the opportunity to work with the Matt Chasins of the world and the companies that are building businesses that have dependency on STEM-based technologies. And so, that to me, that practical intersection, the public-private partnerships, the ability to see inside how those organizations work is what Pia called it lifelong learning, right? That's just going to be the norm moving forward. So not that I have an opinion on it.
Thanks, Melly. Well, we're going to take some rapid fire questions that were pre-submitted. I have been trying to watch the live Q&A a little as well. Matt, talk about some big global innovations in 2021 that haven't gotten a lot of publicity and that now will, because you're going to tell us.
This is actually kind of a hard question because so much gets so much publicity. I think something that kind of has gone under the radar that is fascinating. I think genetics and cloning was really hot, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago when we were like, sequencing the genome for the first. I think a lot of that promise is starting to actually materialize. We all, Dolly was cloned and everything else, but you really now actually there's an Austin startup who's literally bringing back the woolly mammoth, and like these things are actually going to start to be things that we can go and experience, like Jurassic Park is kind of happening. So I think that's kind of under the radar. I don't know, maybe people are following those more than I am, but when I see those things, I think, a lot of the headlines are obviously EVs and Bitcoin and some of the things that a lot of people are experimenting with. But I think we're going to start to see the effects of cloning and some of the genetic stuff that's been developing over the last decade.
So Pia, technology has been allowing us to have these really great productivity gains, and so the economic pie grows and it keeps inflation low. How are you feeling about the continued productivity gains and where we are in that cycle?
I think productivity growth has been a little bit of a puzzle for economists in the last, I would say, 10 or 15 years, in terms of, we know that we see all the technological change, but we haven't necessarily seen productivity growth speed up. In fact, we've seen it slow down. And so there's a big question out there, why is all the technology not translating into faster productivity growth? And so that is a little bit of a puzzle. And I think we don't need to go into all the many reasons that have been suggested, but some of them is that technological change, functions with a lag. So we'll see, sort of the impact on productivity growth of technology in another, 5 or 10 years. And so it just acts with a lag. But we know also, though, that all this technological innovation has lowered the price really of a lot of goods and services. So that's been a disruptor, and it's been significant in terms of increasing really the living standards of people to the extent that technology can do that for us. Now the problem is, I guess, and I talked to contacts, and for example, we mentioned semiconductors earlier. I talked to contacts in that industry, and they're saying, with Moore's law, they say that, the cost of producing these computer chips has been, it declines every year. And then that translates into cheaper chips, into, everything, whether it's cars or video games or phones or whatever we're using technology for. But the speculation in that field, and Matt, maybe better, is that this relationship is winding down and coming to an end, and that it's going to be more costly to produce, the computer chips of the future, and that, prices are going to go up, and that we're not going to have these, declining cost curve like we've seen in the past. And that means that that's going to have a little bit different effect on the type of goods, especially now that, these computer chips are in everything almost. So not sure whether that's going to continue to be, a lid on price growth, and that could reverse itself. I'm curious, Matt, what you think.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not an expert on that area, but it seems like we are sort of nearing the end of the traditional Moore's law, transistors per chip situation. I think, though, that when this tends to happen, there's a step change. I think quantum computing is really fascinating. That gives us a whole nother paradigm, right? That can be 10x, right, instead of 2x. But you slow down, and then I think hopefully we'll have another kind of major step change in processing capabilities.
Well, I think I've got room for one more question, and Melly, you only get about a minute. Do you want to talk about the metaverse?
I alluded to the metaverse. You know, the tie-in here that I just think is so fantastic. You know, going back to the early commercialization of the internet, which I had the privilege of getting to experience. You know, the metaverse to me, it's the beginning of something new. Whether or not it sticks remains to be seen. But what it is, and Matt alluded to it, like great technologies, quantum computing could fundamentally change the future. What's going to be the application of it? And so the metaverse to me is a playground for trying those things on. In that sense, I think it's really interesting. You know, you won't see me buying NFTs and things like that, but it's the earliest place where these innovations happen, and there will be commercial applications that come out of it that'll be transforming and exciting. I'll leave it there because you know me well enough to know I could talk on this for a long time.
Well, I think it's time for me to wrap up. I was so grateful that PM Matt and Melly agreed to come. We thank our co-sponsors once again. They are on screen. Our next 2022 Business Outlook is Friday, February 18th, and we will be discussing real estate. So I hope you will join us next week. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today, and hook 'em horns.